You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and today's conversation will focus on our global economic forecast. What's the growth trajectory of economies around the world? What factors are helping or hurting this growth? And what does all this mean for businesses? Joining me today is the Chief Economist of the Conference Board, Dana Peterson. Dana, welcome.
Hi, Steve. It's always great to be here. Thank you.
So, Dana, the Economy Strategy and Finance Center at the Conference Board is your center. You lead it, and you've just completed your monthly global economic forecast. Talk a bit about, first of all, how do you do this, this forecast? What's the methodology? What dartboards do you use? You don't use dartboards, but, And how do you come up with these forecasts?
Sure. Well, first of all, we have a fantastic team of economists around the globe who spend lots of time and energy looking at economic data and thinking about what things are relevant and how this all should fold up into the forecast. So our forecast, or our outlook, if you will, is broken up into two pieces. We have a short-term outlook and we have a long-term outlook. So that short-term outlook is based upon expenditures or demand, right? So what's going into GDP in terms of what consumers are spending, businesses, governments, and foreign actors. The longer term projections are based upon inputs or supply. So how much inputs we're going to have in terms of labor, capital expenditure, and also efficiency gains, which we call total factor productivity. And we think about all of these things using data from statistical agencies, historical models, economic theory, but also our judgment in terms of expectations on what the trends are going to be looking forward.
So this obviously produces a very thorough forecast every month. Talk about what measures you forecast and what geographies.
Sure. Well, we forecast GDP for over 70 economies, and we do this almost every month. I'm sure, surely there are little tweaks here and there, but we really do focus mainly on very large regions like the US, Europe, and China, as well as the Gulf states. And really those economies direct much of the growth and the activity that we see in the global outlook.
And so most of the data come from, statistical agencies, government agencies,
Yes.
and so forth, right? You use those statistics, but you also, meld that into your own model. You don't, as you go forward, you don't just take government forecasts and put them together. You make your own forecasts.
Yes, definitely. And we also look at what other organizations are doing in terms of, the IMF and the OECD, just to give ourselves a benchmark to see if we're way off on something, if we're missing something. And I would say that oftentimes, we're capturing ideas and changes that may not even be reflected in those other types of forecasts. But yes, we do take private data as well as government data, and we also produce a lot of our own data to come up with our projections for GDP and in some cases for inflation and labor markets.
One unique thing is you have a lot of members of the center who are CFOs and you're engaged with CEOs. So you're getting real-time, everyday input from your members that are in the business community. And that helps you also to forecast.
It definitely does, especially now that we have a really great tool called ESF Community, where our members, it's kind of like LinkedIn, where our members can get on there and post chats, and we pose questions, and we'll ask them things like, what are you planning on doing about the vaccine mandate? What are you planning on doing with respect to wages? And we can take those insights and meld them into our expectations for the future.
Yeah, and this is really important because forecasting isn't just about, you take a trend line and you just straight line it out. It's about, trying to understand where the inflection points are. And so this input from the very highest levels of the largest corporations in the world are uniquely available to you and guide your team. So that's really incredible. Okay, so what everybody wants to know then is, what's it look like? Where are we going? What do the forecasts say?
Sure. Well, we're still expecting very robust growth for 2021. We're almost at the end at this point. The data are certainly a little bit lagged, but for the global economy, around 5% growth, which is really astounding after global growth fell by 3.3 percentage points year on year last year. I think that certainly over the summer, we did downgrade our forecasts a bit to reflect what was going on with the Delta variant. Certainly in terms of it causing backlogs in production and shipping, and certainly further delays in engagement and in-person activities. But certainly the Delta variant did not derail the forecast. So we're still looking at strong growth for this year. We're also looking for above trend growth, trend meaning the average rate of growth that persisted before the pandemic for next year. So the global economy is probably going to grow close to 4%. So that's really strong, especially when we were growing around 3% before the pandemic.
Much is made about, has it recovered? Just think about it from a global standpoint. Are we through it? Are we back on trend? Have we made up the trough, or are we still slightly below that?
Sure. When we look at the global aggregate, we actually have made up what was lost from the pandemic. And I mean that in terms of the level of GDP. We've gotten back to the same level of GDP that we were in before the pandemic. However, when you look beneath the surface at different economies, there's definitely a lot of differentiation. So economies that returned to their pre-pandemic level of GDP included those that were kind of at this nexus between very strong demand for goods and the ability to supply those goods. So the US, very strong demand for goods, and a lot of Asia, China, ASEAN economies being able to supply those goods. And also economies that were able to either produce their own vaccines or purchase vaccines have been able to recover much more quickly. But economies that weren't part of that nexus that I talked about and also were not able to obtain vaccines are lagging. But our view is that by the time we end next year, the end of 2022, 96% of global GDP in terms of economies will have recovered. And so, again, we're looking at a very strong recovery and a rebound after a very difficult period.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the total aggregate world global GDP is back to where it was pre-pandemic, but it should have grown during that period of time. So is the right way to think about it that it's still below where it would have been had it continued to grow at that 3% level, and hence that's why you're saying it'll take till the end of 2022 to make it up? Did I hear that right?
I think that's a good way to think about it. And in fact, the global economy reached its pre-pandemic level of GDP back in the second quarter of this year. Yeah. So, we've had another, 5-6 months or so where there's growth, but certainly there have been losses from the pandemic.
Yeah, sort of the opportunity cost. So if you then think about the regions, I think you're thinking that U.S. will continue to be robust, but so how's that? Talk about that versus China and other markets.
Sure. With the U.S., we expect there to be growth of around, I think, 5% this year, and then next year could be anywhere from 3 to 3.5%, and there's even upside for 4%, certainly if we have passage of some of the fiscal policy plans that the current administration is looking at. So very strong growth next year. And then further out in the horizon, we think that the US economy is probably going to grow around pretty close to 2%. And 2% is actually quite good for an economy that's as mature as the US is, and also is pretty close to the average that we saw in growth over the 20 years before the pandemic. So very strong growth in the US this year and next year, and then slightly above potential growth thereafter. I mean, certainly there are some pretty big risks out there in terms of downsides. One certainly is inflation. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but they're different inflationary forces, and them all coming together at once can potentially dampen how much consumers are spending. And consumer spending is roughly 70% of GDP in the US. There's also the potential that, and we think that the Federal Reserve will start raising interest rates next year, and that can also potentially slow the economy. So that's why I had very wide ranges. Like our forecast for next year is around 3.5%, but it could be 3% if the Fed raises rates very aggressively. But even 3% is very strong when potential is just under 2%.
Yeah, it is amazing. And, we'll come back and talk about some of these other factors. You've talked a lot about the developed world. How do you see the developed world growth evolving versus the developing world? So, there's always these two buckets that people put it in, and every country in each bucket is different, of course. But how do you see them differentiated, and what's going to drive the growth in each?
Sure. Well, let me talk a little bit about China first, and then we'll mesh that into the conversation. China is probably going to grow around 8% this year, and then slow to around 5.5% next year. But even still, that's very rapid. But this slower growth will be on purpose, because China wants to affect something called the long soft fall, where they want to completely change the dynamics of what's driving growth. So instead of focusing on infrastructure and exports, they want to focus more on a consumer-driven economy, so consumption. But with that, there have been a lot of growing pains. So for example, they have this housing bubble and a lot of issues in that area. And they're also at the same time trying to transition their economy from being mainly focused upon coal to more renewables and quote unquote cleaner types of fossil fuels. And that's also causing a lot of growing pains. And so with all that, China is going to slow. But even still, we're expecting that China is going to have very strong growth over the longer run. And so thinking about advanced economies versus emerging markets, and with the advanced economies, again, the US is going to have growth that's going to be pretty similar to what we saw before the pandemic. But in Europe, we're looking at much slower growth, around 1% on average over the next decade. And so not a lot of contribution from there, but certainly most of the growth that we're going to see is going to be among emerging markets. So China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, in the Gulf, certainly as the Gulf transitions away from strong dependency on oil and focusing more on non-oil types of activities. We're expecting that, emerging markets are going to go back to really driving growth. And indeed, when we think about before the pandemic, the share of GDP growth, the growth rate, 55% of it came from emerging markets. And over the next decade, 59% of it's going to come from emerging markets. So that's really what we're going to be looking at, a continuation of emerging markets developing. And certainly when you're developing, you have very high growth rates. Meanwhile, your more mature economies can settle in at very low growth rates in order to be sustainable.
So far, we've talked about the economic forecast globally, and next we'll look a little bit more deeply at region by region and do a deeper dive into factors like inflation and labor shortages. We'll take a short break and be right back with our conversation.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dana Peterson, the Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Okay, so Dana, three regions account for about 70% of the total global economy, and that's roughly defined US, China, and the Eurozone. So just talk a little bit more. You've talked a little bit about the US and China. Talk more specifically about the area. And gosh, if these three groups make up 70%, does it really matter? Does the rest of the world really matter when you're thinking about forecasting?
Well, yes, of course, the rest of the world matters. It's one planet and people are all important. But, in terms of the economy, absolutely, the rest of the world matters because there are linkages via supply chains. So when we think about even the supply chain disruptions that are happening right now, it's not just in China. It's also happening in your other Asian economies in Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. And so those are all small economies that contribute to the global growth and global activities. Also, when you think about where growth is going to be coming from, again, looking at that growth rate over the next decade, a lot of it's going to be coming from these smaller economies, adding them together because they have younger populations, they have growing middle classes, and certainly those big regions that you mentioned, China, US, and Europe, are going to be looking for opportunities to really benefit from these growing middle classes among these smaller economies. And then there's also, just thinking now about the pandemic, health and access to vaccines. Certainly the entire world is not safe until everyone's safe. And certainly if these smaller economies do not receive access to vaccine and are not healthy, then that's going to weigh on global growth in general. So definitely the rest of the world matters. And still that's 30%. That's a lot of people and a lot of GDP there.
It matters more because, they're the least developed, and that means that they're ripe for even higher development. And one example of that you've shared is India, which is growing at a very high rate and has the potential to be one of the largest economies in the world. It isn't today, but they're part of that 30%. But that explosion of growth that's possible there, could really have a material impact on the total global GDP forecast.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So as you think about now, coming out of the pandemic, where do you think we are? I mean, it's impossible to know for sure, but in terms of your forecasting, how do you think about it? Is the pandemic behind us? Or, if you thought about it in baseball terms, what inning are we in?
Sure. The pandemic is not behind us. We're still in it. I mean, certainly when you look at Europe, they're seeing a surge in cases. And certainly in certain parts of the US, you're seeing increases in cases. And so you just keep seeing this cycling and new variants. So the health crisis is still among us. But the key thing is what does it mean for economics? And with each variant and each kind of explosion in cases, you have less of an impact on the economy. Why is that? Well, number one, we're learning to live with it. Certainly, we have more people who have access to vaccines. So many people feel safer once they're vaccinated, are more willing to engage in activities outside of the home. You also have people who may not necessarily have access to vaccines, but they're able to still feel more comfortable knowing that there's more people out there who are less likely to get the disease. And so I think, and also governments are not imposing as many restrictions on activity, even though you may see these increases in cases. So I think that's the key thing. With each round, we're seeing less of an impact on the economy.
But it is still somewhat of a roller coaster, and we just don't know. Nobody knows
Right.
what the variants will deliver to us. But this was something that you talked about in the third quarter when we saw a little lower growth rate versus expectations because of the Delta variant.
Yes, and that's because the Delta variant did a number of things. So in Asia, at the time, you had zero tolerance for cases. And so governments did shut down factories and restricted mobility. In places like the US, you didn't necessarily have increased restrictions on mobility, but yet people felt uncomfortable engaging in in-person services. And so you did see weakening in growth. However, fast forward to September, October, and even November data that we're seeing a pickup in mobility, a pickup in activity, a pickup in consumption. And so we, for the most part, anticipate that the fourth quarter is going to look a lot better around the world relative to the third quarter. Again, because you don't have the big lockdowns and the shutdowns and the sequestration, self-sequestration that we saw with earlier surges in the virus.
We've talked a lot about the U.S. and China. The third leg of the stool is the EU. Any specific insights on the EU?
Yeah, so the EU relative to China and the US is recovering more slowly. But nonetheless, we expect it to fully recover, meaning getting back to that pre-pandemic level GDP early next year. But nonetheless, there are a lot of issues that are potentially weighing on that outlook. Number one, they are having serious issues with respect to supply chains, especially in Germany, which is, usually people think of Germany as being the economic engine of the Euro area, of the EU, excuse me. And they're having huge issues in terms of not being able to acquire semiconductor chips. And so that's weighing on auto production and consequently growth of the region. Europe, the continental Europe, as well as the UK, are dealing with severe labor shortages. And a lot of that in the UK, it's related to Brexit, where there's not as much immigration allowed. And in Europe, a lot of it's travel bans, where migrant workers are not allowed to cross borders. And so you see these tremendous labor shortages. You're also seeing higher inflation. And much of the inflation is reflected for energy prices. And certainly this is a function of issues in terms of how OPEC is producing and supplying energy, but also economies that are looking to move away from use of oil and coal and trying to transition to things like natural gas and renewables. And so there's not been as much investment in the old forms of energy. There's less investment there and not enough investment in the new forms. And that's causing issues around supply, whereas demand is really picking up. And so inflation is a huge issue. Two more things in Europe that are concerns is the EU, the integrity of the EU itself. So for example, you had Brexit a few years ago. There's concerns that Poland might break away. And certainly the more economies that look to break away from the European Union weakens the structure and causes many questions around whether or not it's sustainable. And then finally, a longer term issue is the aging population. We're already seeing that play out in terms of labor shortages in Europe, and it's only going to get worse. So those are some of the things that we're looking at the EU that pose risks to our forecast in the short run, but also speak to the 1% growth we're looking at for the longer run.
Yeah, the term labor productivity is, some people may not understand that if they're not economists, but labor productivity increases added to GDPs for a very long period of time, but that has really dried up over the last 20 years or so, Dana, and so that would be a spark in any of these regions. Talk about what is labor productivity and how could what are you thinking about in terms of potentially picking that up in future years?
Well, actually, we're thinking that labor productivity, or at least the inputs from labor for economies like China, the European Union, the US, is going to decelerate. Why? Because they have these aging populations. So that means you have fewer people aged 25 to 54 to work. And so what do businesses do? Well, they can seek to find labor outside of those economies, but that's prefaced upon public policy and whether immigration is allowed. They can seek to draw in more workers. So for example, older workers who might have retired, trying to bring them back in. You can upskill your existing workers for the new economy, which is more technical and high tech in nature. You can also deploy automation, where you can kind of squeeze more output from your labor by enabling them by pairing them up with machines. So certainly we can have some upsides to that. For example, in Europe, there's been concern about this, reductions in labor productivity. But then, the outcome, the actual tends a surprise to the upside. But still in all, these demographic pressures are not going to go away. And so there are a number of solutions that businesses are going to have to look to address it.
Yeah, and because of the demographic changes and baby boomers retiring and the labor supply coming down, they have to find ways to increase productivity. And maybe I know you've commented on this. Maybe the move to remote work will actually help labor productivity. What are you seeing in that?
Sure. So remote work can be very powerful because it allows you to find labor just about anywhere. And you can cross borders usually with remote work. So you can hire someone who's in Europe and your company may be headquartered in the US. And so in that sense, that's very freeing. And also businesses can help lower costs by being able to hire people in lower and less pricey jurisdictions. So in that sense, that is also a possible solution.
Yeah. I guess the final area, you have to talk about if you're dealing with global forecasts, and you mentioned it a little bit, is inflation. Earlier this year, inflation was expected to be transient, and the Fed has said that, most governments have said that. Yet in recent months, things seem to be picking up. You've sort of parsed it, I think, differently than a lot of economists, rather than saying it's yes, it's transient, or yes or no, it's all persistent. You said there's a little bit of each. Talk about your thinking on inflation.
Sure, absolutely. Indeed, some of it's transitory or temporary. The problem is that these temporary factors keep, seem like they're still lingering, and that's because we've had this continued shock from the pandemic itself. But the temporary factors, which hopefully should dissipate once the pandemic is over or we learn to live with it, include very strong demand for goods. Right. So if people can't go out and engage in in-person services like going to the movies or going on a trip, then they're buying things. And so people are demanding lots of goods, and there's just not enough supply of these goods. And also it's very difficult to move these goods around the world. And so that creates inflation. Strong demand, insufficient supply, inflation. Other things that I think are transitory that will go away is the very easy monetary and fiscal policy that we've seen. So even today, Japan announced that it's going to deploy even more fiscal stimulus. In the US, we've had 3 big rounds of fiscal stimulus. We have, this infrastructure package that's just been passed. There may be another package of money that will be stimulative. But after a while, that's going to stop. And certainly central banks will begin to raise interest rates to reflect the fact that their economies have recovered, and also because we're seeing faster inflation. Also, supply chain bottlenecks, like some of them are going to go away. But other things that I think are more persistent include the semiconductor chip shortage, right? We've heard that, at least in the US, 2 major car makers are looking to create their own supplies of chips. And so I think that the reason why this is more persistent is, number one, it takes a while to build out a chip factory. But number 2, and probably more importantly, there's going to continue to be very strong demand for high-tech goods and products and all the great things that go with it. And they all need chips. And one chip is not the same as the other. And you need separate chips, thousands of chips, different chips, just to go into a car. So I think that's going to persist. I think when we think about housing, there's going to continue to be a very strong wave of demand from millennials. Millennials are now, the oldest ones are in their early 40s. And over the next 20 years, they're all going to be turning 40. And certainly that's the time when, right now, that's when you start hitting peak earnings. And also you begin creating families. So there's going to be very strong demand for housing. And so millennials are going to be driving this demand for housing, and consequently that can place upward pressure on inflation. Labor shortages. We're seeing severe labor shortages again in the US and many parts of Europe. But that's not going to go away again because of the demographic issues. We're going to have smaller workforces, and so we're going to have fewer workers.
All told, then, it doesn't sound like inflation is going to be forever, this level of inflation, but it doesn't sound like it's, like it's over. So, another year or two, maybe.
Well, again, it's going to depend on the region. So for the US, base effects are going to start working in our favor starting next year. So the year-on-year rates will be lower, but we think that we're probably not going to get back below the Fed's 2% target by the end of next year because of these other more persistent factors, including labor shortages and wage increases that are probably feeding into inflation. For other economies, the timing is going to be different. Certainly in Europe, inflationary pressures are now coming to the fore, whereas in the US, we saw this 9 months ago. So I think that, in aggregate, you probably are going to continue to see inflationary pressures and inflation above central bank targets over the course of next year.
Yeah. Dana Peterson, Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every couple of weeks, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with all of your colleagues, your friends, everybody. I know that they'll want to read it, listen to it. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.